So in the second part of this series, I'm going to show you how I made the base as well as the adjustable shelves for this storage cabinet. I consider this to be a DIY friendly build, maybe a little advanced DIY just because the cabinet's so simplistic. So to make the base, I'm just using 2x6s. You're never going to see it. I thought of using 3/4 inch poplar, but it's a little bit more expensive. For this, I could use 2x6s. I could rip them down into the shapes I needed and make the base. The reason for that is the base is hidden. The customer wanted a very streamlined cabinet with little to no details, which also lends to this being a DIY project. You can take a cabinet like this and add little details and make it your own pretty simply if you know how to make just the basic box. And she wanted the legs to be flush with the outer edges of the cabinet with no seams, so frame and panel construction was kind of out of the question for this. In order to do that, I decided to make a hidden base. So this base is 2 inches thick. It's going to be hidden underneath the cabinet so you can't see it, but strong enough to hold up the weight of the whole cabinet. That was kind of what I came up with to deal with that. I treat pieces of furniture like this that are fairly large, kind of like tables. I wouldn't make a kitchen table and just put 4 legs on it without any sort of aprons or stretchers. So I wanted there to be some connections between the legs and the cabinet. So it's going to have this whole framing system underneath. You can see I basically cut all my pieces to 2 inches. I could have left them thicker like this, but it's easier because I'm doing dados to cut them into 3/4 inch strips. So basically the beginning part of this whole video is taking those 2x6s, cutting them into rough lengths, ripping them down on the table saw, cleaning up the edges because these are 2x4, so they're going to be a little rough, and then I'm going to dimension them down to about 3/4 of an inch. Like I said, a little bit more work than just using already machined 3/4 inch lumber, but that stuff gets pretty expensive, so it kind of works out cost material wise with more labor but cheaper materials. So that's basically what I'm doing here. I'm just keep on cutting down those pieces, and like I said, I did this just so it was a little bit easier to use my dado stack. My stack doesn't go above an inch. It's easier to do 3/4. So once I had that stack of material, like I said, it's all oversized. I can measure my long lengths. If your cabinet does not glue up square, those lengths are not going to be the same. Mine were almost identical, so I cut to the same size, and then I can kind of plop them into place. So you can see how this frame is going to sit on the inside of this cabinet, and it will be hidden by that larger face frame I have on the top and the bottom. And same process in the back. So you can see in my drawing, it's a very similar concept. I kind of space these out evenly, but realistically speaking, the spacing of this is not super important if it's not identical, but it's easy to cut it the way I'm going to cut it on the radial arm saw. I start at center and work on edges, and then I just put 2 equidistant pieces on in between. So with the edges, it's pretty easy. I could set up a stop and just cut those 3/4 inch rabbets. So I have a 3/4 inch stack in the saw. It's raised up, so it's only going about 3/8 of an inch through the piece. And on the edges, that will create a rabbet. In the middles, that will create dados. And then slats can go in there, and the whole thing can be glued together. So you can see I can move my fence, I could flip this around, and I could do 2 pieces at the same time. So zoomed out a little bit so you could see that process, and that's how they'll work. Now people will put just screw-on legs on the bottom of furniture, and depending on the piece of furniture, I think that's okay. But for something this big that's going to be used as storage, so it will always be full, and this heavy, because plywood's very heavy, I just personally like to make a frame for the legs. So that is why I went through all this extra work. And then I could just cut the slats. They're all the same size. They're 3/4 of an inch, so they just tap right into that dado, and then you can kind of see how that inner frame is going to work. Now, realistically speaking, you can kind of attach any style legs to this with some through tenons, but like I said, she wanted these in the corner. So for the legs, I'm just using 4x4 Douglas fir from Lowe's. This is going to be painted. You can get away with a lot with paint grade furniture. Right now it's 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches because that is the dimensions of a 4x4. So I want to get it down to 3x3. So I'm going to cut a 1/4 inch off each side. That will also clean up the material because this is rough lumber, so it will save on sanding time. So all I did was send this through the table saw 2 sides. I'm taking off a 1/4, and then I can move my fence over to 3 inches and then take off a 1/4 from the last 2 sides, and then the whole thing will be 3 inches. Like I said, you could use other materials, but for something that's going to be painted, it was fine to use this. So I could take that down, and then that is my piece. And then she wanted this 6 inches above the floor so that she could vacuum underneath of it, and it cleared the molding in her home. So 2 inches are going to be lost into the base. So once I had this ripped down, I could then cut all of this into 8-inch sections, and that is going to be what the size of the legs are. You can set up a stop and cut every piece. I cut that 4x4 in half, so I actually ended up with 4 legs and a little bit extra just in case I mess up, which is always nice reassurance. So then all I'm going to do is remove some of the material so that this fits in here, kind of like the corners are almost like lap joints and through tenons. So I'm going to remove a bunch of material so that only a little piece will fit into that cabinet. Now the problem with this was the thickness in the front of the cabinet is different than the thickness in the back. So I have to cut 2 legs similarly and then the other 2 the same. So I had to keep adjusting my setups for my tools. But basically you could see I marked how much material had to be removed. I'm going 2 inches I need, so I have that stop set up as 2 inches away from the cut of the blade, and I could cut through and create curves. Once I have those curved cuts in the legs, I could take them to the table saw, and I have a tenoning jig, a fancier version of it, that will remove the rest of the material. You do not need a super fancy jig to do this. Before I got the fancy tenoning jig, I just had one that slid on the top of my table saw fence. So I could raise the height of that blade, and then I could use this jig to line up my marks and remove the material on the rest of these. So the one problem with this jig is there's not a ton of left to right movement, so you'll see sometimes I don't have enough clearance to make the cuts and I have to move the jig into the other track, but in general it does give you nice perpendicular clean cuts. So like I said, 2 of these are pretty much identical, and then the 2 front ones are going to be the same, so I kept flipping and having to maneuver pieces around in order to get all of those cuts. This is what I'm left with. It was a pretty clean cut. There's a little bit of cleanup to do, but I could take it over to the cabinet and you can see how that is going to fit in the corner. This really amplifies the gluing surface of the piece, which will make that joint really strong, and it's going to give you edge grain, not just end grain to glue to, which is going to make it stronger as well. Now if you really wanted to, after you glued that up, you could go through and maybe add some dowels in there. I don't find that to be necessary. The glue is strong enough within itself, but if you wanted to for added insurance, you could always do that. And then there's the ones in the front. You can see now they line up perfectly with the outside of the cabinet, which is exactly what I was looking for. Once those were cut, I could glue everything together. This is all plywood, so it's somewhat dimensionally stable, so I ended up gluing my frame directly to the cabinet. I could glue all of my slats in place, glue all of the legs in place, and clamp everything. And I've had this kicking around the shop for a couple weeks because I'm working on multiple things at once. I've had no issues with the legs. So then while this is upside down, it was the easiest time to drill the holes for the adjustable shelves. I like to do this with pegboard. I usually buy a sheet of pegboard. It lasts me a couple years because I don't do a lot of adjustable shelves. I can cut up that pegboard so it fits inside my cabinets perfectly, and then a 1/4 inch drill bit fits inside this 1/4 inch pegboard perfectly, and I can get perfectly laid out holes. I know they sell jigs for this sort of stuff, but honestly, like I said, I think I do adjustable shelves like once a year. So for stuff like that, I don't like spending money on a jig. This works perfectly fine. I'm not a lover of adjustable shelves. I like fixed in place shelves because they make the piece of furniture more stable. But because this cabinet's so small and the shelves are not super wide, these actually ended up working out quite nicely and are movable. So those are the shelf pins. Like I said, they're 1/4-inch holes, so 1/4-inch shelf pins. And then she wanted 2 shelves per opening, so I could go through with the scrap and make the shelves. You can see I get a little bit of tear out, but like I said, paint grade, I could go and patch that and paint it, and everything will be fine for that. Everything lines up. The two shelf pins fit through the 1/4-inch, so you could see they were on the same hole and they don't hit each other. And then I could go through and take measurements for the shelves. There's 2 longer shelves, 4 shorter shelves, and luckily, since they're all 16 1/4, because that's the inside dimension of the cabinet, all that scrap I had cut off from the pieces I made for the top and the bottom is already the perfect depth, so I could just go and cut it down to size and plop these into place. These will get edge banding on them because they are plywood, but for the time being I left them the way they are. The next videos should be the last part of the series. Like I said, it's a pretty easy build. Be finishing up the shelves, putting on the top, the doors, and then the paint.